I have a question, and I'm guessing that Syria is going to play large in this. I've been today. I was interviewed by Politico. I was a guest on a news network, a radio news network. It's like everybody wants to talk about Syria. So I get that, and that's fine. And I'll say it again. When I wrote this book, The Crash of 2016, which is going to be coming out in a month or so, and just became available for pre-order, I essentially warned, not essentially, I came right out and warned that economic disasters lead to wars, and be very, very careful. You go back and you look at the history of Syria, and what really started the situation in Syria is climate change, global climate change. I've got another new book out. This is a short ebook that just became available. It's over, you can get it at Kindle on Amazon. It's 99 cents. We basically wanted to give it away, but you've got to assign a price to it, called The Last Hours of Humanity, and it's about global climate change. And that's what happened in Syria. In 2006, a drought began as climate change is moving basically the Sahara Desert, or the middle, the desert that runs across the middle part of northern Africa and the Middle East. And as this desert moved into areas of Syria where they had been producing food, you saw in 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, you saw food production fall by up to 80%. Over 1 million farmers, and these were farmers who had been quite prosperous. They had farms that had been in the families for generations, and they had been principally producing wheat, but they were producing barley and millet and other grains. These farmers were wiped out. I mean, their farms were turned into dust, into desert. And they came into the city, into Damascus and Home and some of the other large cities. There's not that many large cities in Syria, principally Damascus. They came into the cities looking for work, and what they discovered was that there was already 500,000 Palestinian refugees there. There were refugees there from the Iraq War. There's somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million Iraq refugees living in Syria. And then you got the Syrians themselves, people who'd been living in the city forever. And so these farmers who had been pretty high on the food chain and fairly affluent and prosperous and owned land that had value, suddenly their land had no value, they had no money, they had no food, and they're living in the city cleaning toilets for a living, or trying to, and finding themselves in competition for those toilet cleaning type of jobs, finding themselves in competition for those kinds of jobs with Palestinian refugees and Iraqi refugees. It was a disaster. And then as the price of wheat spiraled up in 2000, as I recall, it was 2007. I don't have this timeline right in front of me here. I'm running this off from memory, so I may be a year off here or there. Apologies in advance. But remember that spike in wheat prices when Matt Taibbi did a great takedown piece on Goldman Sachs. It turned out that Goldman Sachs and a bunch of banksters in Wall Street had been gaming the commodities market, and they jacked up the price of wheat for a few months, and it produced wheat riots around the world. Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people died, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people were involved in these food riots, from Bangladesh to Syria. And the Assad government had this huge stockpile of wheat. And they made this terrible mistake, and I think this was 2007. They made this terrible mistake of when the price of wheat went way, way up, they sold their supplies, their strategic stockpiles, thinking that this global climate change stuff was just, it's just a year or two of bad weather. The drought has not gone away yet. In fact, it's getting worse. And when they sold the wheat, the next year, they didn't have any wheat. They couldn't feed their own people. And that's when you saw people starting, this was the Arab Spring time, right? I mean, this is when you saw people starting to protest Actually, it kind of preceded the Arab Spring in some ways. This was 2008. This is people were out in the streets protesting the lack of food and the lack of food subsidies. The Assad government could no longer, provide food to them. So global climate change drove a crisis, what became an economic crisis, that became a war. Because when the people started protesting, the Assad government, their response to the protests was sort of like, I was going to say it was sort of like, the University of California at Davis against the Occupy movement. Remember where the guy just pepper sprayed that whole group of people who were just sitting there, pepper sprayed them in the face. But the Assad government was far worse. They went out and people in the streets protesting the lack of food, they just shot them. Which then produced a response. People were really upset. And boom, next thing you know, you got a civil war going. And it all began with ExxonMobil and the Koch brothers. And it all began with the oil companies dumping carbon into the atmosphere, producing climate change, producing drought. And then it got exacerbated by Goldman Sachs making billions of dollars by manipulating wheat futures. It's amazing how all this stuff kind of fits together, So, for those of you curious about my warnings on this and our new book, The Last Hours of Humanity, is all about how global climate change could lead to extinction. You've heard me talk about it here before. And in the next week or so, we're going to have a little video out about it as well. I'll announce it when it comes out. And the book, The Crash of 2016, is about how these kinds of things, we had the Dust Bowl in the United States back in the 30s that was accompanying the economic crisis. And, to some extent, the economic crisis was brought about by the Roaring '20s, and the Roaring '20s in part were fed by unsustainable land practices, farming practices, the plow. This was, we were just 30 years into gasoline-powered tractors at that point. So we started plowing land in ways that had never been done before, and it turned that land into dust. And it just, this is why FDR created the CCC and started planting trees, trying to restabilize the land in the 30s. So, it wasn't global warming, it was bad agricultural practices, but the consequence was the same. There were food shortages and there was land crises, and this produced its own set of problems. So anyhow, you look at Syria, you look at this, you look at all these various things and see how all these things fit together, and it's like, whoa, this is fascinating. And then we think we're going to solve this problem, a global warming caused problem in Syria. We're going to solve it by dropping some bombs. Really? I got to tell you, these generals who are hanging out at the White House, it's not what they're smoking, it's that they're not smoking something, right? We need to decriminalize pot and get somebody, enough said on that, I guess. John McCain seems to agree with me on that one.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Did you see that? He was just kind of musing earlier today, and he said, well, maybe we should decriminalize marijuana. Yeah, 15 minutes past the hour.